And it's 27 to 5. Look, when the recent call for monoculturalism was made, I must admit I couldn't even begin to imagine what that would look like in Australia, because that's a society where everyone has to conform to the same norms, language, religion, and behaviours, and usually that has to come with strict isolation as well. And to be honest, didn't sound all that appealing. But on the flip side, is it too easy to see multiculturalism as just the foods we love and some ethnic music and dancing? In a recent post, Jonathan Swaranganathan, former Greens councillor for the Gabba ward and former Greens Lord Mayoral candidate, argued that for him, polyculturalism might be a better option than multiculturalism. But what do both of those things look like, and how would polyculturalism even work? Jonathan, hello.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yes, I did read the whole thing. What do you think? Is Australia a successful multicultural country?
I guess, yeah, I would say the short answer is kind of yeah, but it really depends how you define this stuff. And for me, one of my criticisms of what we might call establishment multiculturalism is that it really flattens what we think of when we think about cultural diversity. And as you sort of alluded to, too often defenses of multiculturalism or like examples of multiculturalism are simplified down to, oh, there are different kinds of food or different dance traditions. But I think that does us all a disservice, because there are much more significant and meaningful distinctions between cultures. And I'm talking here about like different practices in terms of how you educate and raise your kids, or different practices in terms of whether you put your elderly parents in a nursing home or whether you feel that they should live with you and you look after them directly, those sorts of differences. And then even those like more fundamental philosophical divergences, like, do we think humans have control of our own lives, or has some god planned it all out for us? Like, those are the big, more substantial differences between cultures. And it's in learning from those differences that we stand to gain a lot from multiculturalism. So I'd say Australia is reasonably successful in that most of the time people get along pretty well until you get this sort of divisive, polarizing politics rearing its head. But racism is still very prevalent in Australia, and I would argue it's been getting a lot worse throughout my lifetime. So I don't want to sort of sugarcoat it.
That's interesting. I am a white middle class woman, so in the big scheme of things, it's really just white middle class men that sort of outrank me in the hierarchy, if you know what I mean. So I don't get to experience racism. How has it gotten worse in your lifetime?
Oh, I'd say even sort of for the 7 years that I was a city councillor, I noticed a big spike. I think the sort of overt racism that you encounter of people like calling you names or disparaging you based on your perceived ethnic background has increased. Like, it's become more commonplace for people to make offensive racist remarks or racist jokes. But even at a deeper level, when you look at the data and the statistics in terms of, for example, high rates of Aboriginal incarceration, or the fact that people with Asian-sounding surnames find it harder to get jobs, even when they have exactly the same resume as someone with an Anglo-sounding name. Like, at a structural level, there are all these data sets showing that it's not just sort of that superficial, oh, a person on the bus yelled a racial slur. It's that deeper stuff where people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds are finding different outcomes in life as a result of those differences.
With some of the things you mentioned, such as elderly parents in nursing homes, for example, we had to put my dad in the nursing home, but my mum lives with me. So sometimes I feel that the differences we see as perhaps being a racial divide aren't. They're just a thinking divide, an ideology.
And this is one of the beautiful things about culture, right? It's not like we're all just neatly boxed into a certain culture, that there's this sort of Tamil culture and then Irish culture and then sort of Anglo, like, cultures are always mixing, they're always in dialogue with each other, they're always informing each other. And right now, and again, this is part of, I think, what's going on with establishment multiculturalism, is that there is a dominant culture that says, to be a good human, you need to live a certain way, which is to pursue your own financial self-interest and to care mostly about your own immediate family and a few close friends. It's kind of a very individualistic cultural norm. And that's different to lots of other cultures around the world. But people from other parts of the world will still have those individualistic tendencies. It's all blurring and cross-pollinating all the time, and that's a beautiful thing.
Jonathan, but if you come to Australia and you want to live that life where you do think about others first, and culturally you are supporting those people around you, and all the things you've mentioned, which sound great, by the way, but you can still do that, can't you? Even though the dominant culture might be, I'm thinking about me and mine first. If you want to live that life, what makes that difficult in Australia?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of it comes down to financial pressures, like but even say the way housing is structured, for example, like our housing is designed mostly for a nuclear family ideal, which makes intergenerational living really difficult.
I think we're starting to look at
yeah, people are asking these questions.
Yeah, but also house design.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people you talk to now are saying, yeah, well, I'm probably going to have mum or dad living with me, and my adult children are going nowhere.
Yeah.
So being forced into
totally.
it.
Yeah, exactly. But so the built form of our city shapes what kinds of ways of life are open to us. Our transport networks shape what ways of life are open to us. Certainly working conditions, but even say rules about what's open at what times of day and what times of week. Like there are so many laws and regulations and investment decisions that shape how we can live our lives. So I think compared to a lot of countries, Australia is still reasonably open in allowing people a certain breadth of cultural expression. But there's still a very strong dominant culture. And when people diverge strongly from that dominant culture, they're more likely to be the target of racism.
How much of moving to a new country is assimilating, at least to some point, into that culture? If I was to move to another country, I would expect that I actually would have to fit in to how they were living their lives.
And like, I'm not an anthropologist or a cultural studies expert. Like, I'm a musician and a poet, so I'm doing more of the practical culture stuff. But I think there's an important difference between assimilation and integration. And a lot of demands for assimilation, I think, are overtly racist. They're saying that you all have to scrub away everything that makes you unique and special and assimilate to this one dominant culture. Whereas some theorists would say integrating is perhaps a better ideal, where you retain the flexibility to be who you are and all the important aspects of your own cultural identity, but you can still fit into society as it exists currently. There'd be some people though who say that actually we should have an even more open and anarchic idea of cultural pluralism, where cultures are constantly cross-pollinating with each other, and we have a fairly narrow set of norms that everyone agrees to, like don't be violent towards other people and don't steal other people's personal property. And that as long as you're not doing that sort of stuff, you should be free to live your life however you want. But like, we can look at the long history of Australia, for example, in relation to First Nations people, and the dominant Australian culture has continually told First Nations people, you need to live like this, you need to assimilate into this way of life, rather than the two cultures adapting to and integrating with each other.
Something we still struggle with.
Yeah, big time. Yeah.
But don't you? I just feel like racism is something that's going to happen anyhow. It's like being bullied at school. It's going to happen. It'll either be your hair color or your weight or the way you say something, or you know what I mean, or skin color.
Sure.
They will find a way to get at you if they want to get at you.
Maybe that's true, but I think what we have to recognize is that racism is not just the same as two kids bullying each other in the school playground. It's oppression backed by structural power. Like, there are so many economic forces, political forces that give some people who are doing the racism a lot more power than people on the receiving end. And that's why, for example, when someone who's in a position of relative privilege, like maybe they're rich and they're from a Western European background, they're like, oh, I'm experiencing reverse racism. It's like, sure, someone made a joke about you being white, but you still have all the advantages that have accrued as a result of colonialism and years of global imperialism and all that sort of stuff. So racism, it's not just about people calling each other names. It's about the laws and the money that sits behind certain power relationships. And that's why when we see racism directed against Muslim migrants or against Aboriginal people, it's so problematic and powerful, not just because it's people being mean to each other, but because there's real substantive weight behind that oppression that's such a cause of concern. So maybe you're right that racism or xenophobia of a kind might always exist in every society, but those power imbalances are getting really big in Australia, and that's perhaps the underlying problem, is that economic and political power imbalance.
then how do we address that? Like, where
Whoa,
do we
how
even
long have we got?
start with that? Well,
Yeah.
it's just huge, because unless if it's about power and it's about money, then the only way you get that really is by integrating yourself into the very structures that give you power and influence and money.
Yeah, and you're talking to an anti-capitalist here, so
Yes,
like, you know,
exactly.
but I think, and this is one of the things I tried to draw out in the piece, and that maybe people will be able to get into if you give it a read,
Yeah.
is this idea that we shouldn't insist on cultures as being fixed in time and clearly separate from each other, and that's one of the weaknesses of dominant multiculturalism, is that even the way, say, governments support cultural diversity is that they'll give some funding to this community association, or they'll give some funding to this discrete festival for this one culture, rather than putting support into programs that encourage cultural mix-in and that support people to borrow and learn from each other's cultures in a way that's not appropriating their cultures. And when you get that sort of deeper, richer kind of cultural mix-in, then people are learning from each other about not just what food they eat or what clothes they wear to their weekend folk dancing or whatever. They're learning about the different ways that people see the world, and realizing that there are differences that have value, but that there are also fundamental commonalities. And so, I mean, it's well established in that often the areas that have the highest degree proportions of racism and the least tolerance of cultural diversity are also the areas where people have had the least exposure to people of different cultures. So one of the best antidotes to racism is people actually culturally mix it, for people from different cultures actually mix in a way that is egalitarian and genuine and not extractive or consumerist. And I think that's the big risk, is that so much of our cultural interchange is about how it can be packaged up and sold, or made digestible for a sort of temporary exoticized consumer, rather than a genuine meeting of different cultures and sharing and cross-pollinating.
Right. Well, it was a fascinating read.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for coming in and chatting about it. Jonathan Sriranganathan, former Greens councillor for the Gabba ward and former Greens Lord Mayoral candidate. And you can read that on your website if you want to go through and have a read.
JonathanSri.com.
Yep, that's it. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks for the chat.